John Harvey is our next speaker, and John is a associate professor at St. Cloud State University. He has numerous publications. I'll just do two or three. This one, for my generation, I need to look at. It's an it's an introduction. Robert Roswell Palmer, A Transatlantic Journey of the American Liberalism. All of us raised on Palmer Colton and Palmer himself. Some analytical work would be really interesting. In addition, The Nation, Progress, and European Identity in the Rise of Modern Europe, in the book Nationalizing the Past, Historians Nation Building, and just one more example, An American Now, the Revue Internationale d'Histoire Économique of Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre in the Journal of Modern History, and many conference papers and more. And today he's going to speak to us on Did the British Overtake American Anglophone Interpretations of the French Revolution, 1970 to 2000. John.
Thank you, Jack.
Sure.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for attending this panel, which, as with Jack, I found to be very, very interesting in terms of my other two colleagues' papers. This presentation that I have is the first half of a larger paper that I sent out to the panel. The second half of that paper talks about the linguistic readings of historiography. I will only be able to speak very, very briefly and in a summary fashion to that. I'll be concentrating on the first half of the paper, although the commentator, of course, has the freedom to speak to the entire work. And if anyone wants to contact me about this as we are being recorded, please do feel free. This is about the generation of historians who are so formative in everything that we've learned and done. So, my communication today summarizes a larger study offered to our panel in which I consider historiography on the general French Revolutionary era as it developed in Anglophone countries during the last third of the 20th century. Other than some brief notes by Richard Evans, we really have up to this date no study to suggest how the academic field of what we'll call French history has developed outside of America in the Anglophone world, such as in Ireland or Britain, or you could think of the wider Commonwealth. We do have a little bit from Australia, but other than that, French historiography in the rest of the old Commonwealth lacks its own history. American scholars have sought to question our own development in books such as Why France and Other Testimonials. Within this global condition, therefore, up till today, we tend to assume, and one can see it in reading historiography, that English language views about the French past, rest on a united chorus of a monde Anglo-Saxon. One sees this term all the time. In my view, I see it as something of a historiographical Sasquatch, often cited but never really met or encountered. I always joke I don't know who this Anglo-Saxon person is. I'd like to meet him one day, or her. As some of the most vivid debate in French history has centered on the late Enlightenment to the Napoleonic era, this talk will ask whether interpretive meaning of the Revolution has actually been grounded in a nuanced national basis within Anglophone scholarship. Question: did national architectures of education, politics, and culture shape how Frenchness was researched and taught? And does it still today? Implications on our own debate about how the historiography of the French Revolution developed in the latter third of the 20th century. In order to have something concrete which everyone can go by, I developed a 4-part thesis. Part 1, and it's a thesis that everyone can test it by your own lived experience. By the 1960s, a common professionalization process began to accelerate in the academic disciplines in the United States, Britain, and Britain's former Commonwealth states. Over time, this process helped especially to transform the Guild of Historians who specialized in the French Revolutionary era. Part 2. Until the end of the 20th century, professionalization exerted different impacts on historians trained in America compared to England. This was not intentional. But aside from Western Civ textbooks, American specialists ceased, by and large, to publish synthetic overviews on the Revolution until the mid-1990s, starting with Jeremy Popkin and Jack Sensor and Lynn Hunt. They began to reappear. This left a vacuum. And into this vacuum, English-trained historians increased their output both of new research and synthetic works that they alone authored for their students and the wider public. Part 3. This near 30-year vacuum meant that English language interpretation of the era as a whole was led by historians who represented, now I have caveats here, but represented an English tradition of seeing the French Revolution. This tradition is not homogeneous. It is not. But the generation trained in England did, I believe, hold certain empirical skepticism of presentism and especially the utility of social theory. It was generally suspicious of Marxist perspectives as well as what they might consider a nationalist Republican tradition of a powerful revolutionary state in Europe. Final part, part 4 of the thesis. In consonance with the rise of revisionism after 1970 in France itself, this new dynamic encouraged overall a more jaded general view about the European Enlightenment and Napoleonic era as it appeared in these synthetic works in the latter third of the 20th century. So that until 2000, the major English language narrative became more skeptical of the legacy of revolutionary-oriented forces, including populist forces and democracy, even as the generation of American specialists after 1970, in my view, reflected an increasingly what we might call left-liberal endorsement of democracy and popular sovereignty, if not outright revolution. Okay, let me unpack this. The professionalization process is vital to compare how a discipline from different national climates can evolve in similar directions, but with key notable differences too. I use the term process because professional standards develop historically over time. We must thus be cognizant of complexity, different rates of change, and even inconsistencies beneath the surface of broad common directions. A professionalization process, in my view, is the conditions by which faculty units operate. For our discussion here, I would call it this: the replacement of individual preferences for the function of an institution by new, more or less consensual standards accepted through communities of equal participating academics and respected by their managerial supervisors, deans, chairs, provosts, and presidents. Central to this process by the 1970s was an increased emphasis on expertise, new research, and peer-reviewed publication. In America, the profession's development can be tracked by its rate of expansion and by the degree to which specialization accelerated within definable subject fields. These changes were particularly stark in an approximate 10-year period from about 1965 to the mid-70s. I have a chart here that maps out a decade of revolution, and I think it was a real decade of substantial change, especially amongst degree-granting institutions, the top 12 for French history. These changes were particularly stark in the approximate 10-year period. New journals with increased peer review and conference groups devoted to France expanded with a burst. Indeed, by the 1970s at least, leading editors were noting how this multiplication could still not keep pace with an ever-rising number of article proposals. As an example, pressure to publish new research only intensified in context with the status of the university in question. By the 1980s, the Research One universities requiring tenure and promotion wanted at least one new monograph, and despite cries throughout the discipline of a publication crisis or talks about low-scale printings, the monograph became the template for a successful academic career at least a research-intensive university. This modernization, of course, came at a relative cost. The pressure to publish and the push of specialization could weaken the profession's capacity to adapt a consensual narrative of our past, bringing other political and intellectual challenges. Also lost, perhaps, was somewhat a focus on pedagogy or pedagogical tools as everyone's working on the new research. In French history by the late 1960s, the production of textbooks, therefore, or surveys other than Western Civ simply halted, as it was seen to be, quote, as I think William McNeill said, holding up one's professional progress. For a quarter century, therefore, the sole survey of French Revolution, the only one that was produced after 1970, was by Owen Connolly, a traditional historian at South Carolina, a George Taylor student. From 1965 to the mid-70s, fields in French history witnessed an entire renewal of leadership, as I mentioned. A confident new generation, therefore, was coming up in America, center-left, and perhaps more center-left than their predecessors, in part, perhaps, because of the radicalization processes of the 1960s and the Vietnam War and civil rights, and in part because of the diversification of doctoral students, professors, away from a template that was solely that of white men married with families. We had a great demographic diversification throughout the 1970s. The professionalization process was not monolithically determinative. It wasn't. But its emphasis on publication exerted perhaps an invisible pull on the direction of American historians of France. Aside from the pressure to publish, the erosion of Marxist socialist liberal consensus after 1965 for the French Revolutionary era historiography left especially younger American scholars perhaps somewhat adrift without an interpretive compass. I think you can see this in the response to Cobbin, for example. If Lefebvre's consensus history was obsolete, question, could the revolution still hold up the legitimacy of anti-monarchical revolution considering America's origins? Question, could it support the public spirit of social change that defined the ideals which faculties of the 1970s to the 1990s had internalized from their youth? For 2 decades, Americans attempted to chart a new path which placed admirers of the revolution somewhat, perhaps, if you read the historiography, on the relative defensive, vulnerable perhaps to more determined or confident voices from abroad, such as Simon Schama. Even as professionalism impacted the Guild, historians continued to roll out, of course, Western Civ textbooks for the required survey courses. Civ is very important here. But Civ was closely tied to the growth of European and French history throughout the entire 20th century. With a fundamentally civic goal, specialized research on French Revolution was invested, in my view, in the cumulative body of Western Civ textbooks, and I believe that Western Civ as a textbook tended to be centered on what we might call non-communist left liberalism. Before the 1960s, American specialists of Europe commonly published one work of original research based on one overseas research trip. So this is Americans who got their dissertations done before the 1960s. In part, this was due to the chaotic climate of Europe for research before the 1950s. But overall, even administrators at the research universities often did not link tenure promotion to production standards of new peer-reviewed research. If general education was valued over research at these large universities, and the politics of the personal could define career experience, then factors intrinsic or extrinsic, to critical publication of expertise define much, though not all, of the concrete careers of Americans Guild of Europeanists. Then, to complete a post-tenure second book, while still residing in America or even on their campus, a popular option until the 1960s was a single-volume survey for the textbook market. They brought money, they brought promotion to full professor, they served a growing national student body, and the Academy before the 60s had, after all, valued that. Western Civ thus allowed historians to supplement the overarching textbook with specialized single text books on topics such as Europe or France during the years of Revolution. This classic tradition supported a steady stream of original research with a parallel current of broad interpretation that was aimed directly to a broad civic audience, especially of students. And pride of place in the Western Civ narrative was the European Enlightenment and the French Revolution. It had to be a good thing for America. But Civ was atypical to America. It was a common foyer for American undergraduates, but it was never adopted in Britain. In Canada, it was adopted case by case by institutions, and it could vary even up until the 1960s. Most of all, there simply was no common civic spinal cord for a European narrative akin to the American survey once you left America. At some London colleges, and especially Oxbridge, education was based on the intimate experience of tutorship, sprinkled with lectures offered on state-focused topics. Compared to America, the English approach to undergraduate coursework was more detailed, it was more personal, and demanded a greater time of study. It was in part by the university tradition of undergrad exams, really a network of tests followed by at the end of each annual teaching semester. And I passed out to everyone a hard copy of a photo to get an idea of that pastness. So what you have before you, everyone, is the University College London, University of London, and that's 1965 spring. I thank the Lagos for allowing me permission to show this. There is Alfred Cobbin sitting in the center. Everyone, the photo you see is the entire undergraduate group, all 3 years, reading history. That's not graduate students, that's the entire undergraduate and faculty. That gives you a sense how intimate it could be. As professionalization encouraged the end of the writing of single-volume surveys in America, it left a vacuum of general narratives on the Revolutionary era. As there was nothing between monographs and the multi-authored general civ textbooks in America based on uncontroversial descriptive narrative and not individual authorship. That interpretive vacuum, like as I said, was filled after the 1960s from England, which extended its influence more widely throughout its former Commonwealth states. Prior to the 1960s, the British system was generally uninterested in sustained primary source research on the continent. Universities before the 1960s, after all, were to train elite young men from property class for leadership in law, government, foreign affairs, and especially imperial service. As professionalism developed in history, however, after 1950, pedagogy focused on domestic content with no real effort to compete with Europeans' continental standards of post-bachelor education. Then, as I say, Oxford and London introduced the doctorate only after 1920, and until Alfred Cobbin obtained the University of London's chair in French history in 1953, no doctoral degrees were being earned in French history at all. Simply put, original research was not done. One struggles to find before the 1950s a concerted effort to promote competitive standards in the production of continental European history as we would see them today. The expansion of access, however, to higher education in the post-war decades eventually necessitated a dramatic growth in the history faculties of existing institutions in the UK, even before the creation of new plate-glass universities after 1964. Britain's close entanglement with the continent, think NATO and EU, along with the loss of empire, meant that universities committed more attention to the history of continental Europe, including France. So what we might call a takeoff after 1950 of professional specialists on modern France occurred, and they would be, in my view, very distinct from their American counterparts. Doctorate production started after all, at ground zero. It would be done through the key English universities, University of London, Cambridge, Oxford, at best 1 or 2 red brick universities. And the rest of the UK simply did not invest in the advanced training for future faculty in French history. In England, it was particularly consolidated, therefore, not just at 3 universities at best, but really under only a few individuals at these universities. Training doctorates in French history for the Enlightenment and Napoleonic eras began with Alfred Cobbin by the 1950s, followed by Richard Cobb when he arrived at Balliol College, Oxford in 1962. The other chart that I gave you is the list of the entire student body, everyone who did a PhD under Cobb and Cobbin, and on the back page you have a list of other people who were trained in the topics that we're covering here. That is the only possible list that we have existing. It is based upon a great deal of interviews and testimonials from people who are all on that list. Now, Norman Hampson, with his Sorbonne thèse, from 1955, remained at an English red brick university throughout his career, and he really did not have but one doctoral student. From the 1950s to the 1980s, I think Cambridge kind of failed to establish training in French history for the Revolutionary era, aside from some scattered doctorates under Bury on the Third Republic era. Overwhelmingly, therefore, doctoral production in French Revolutionary history rested with Cobb and then John Roberts at Oxford, Alfred Cobb and his successor Douglas Johnson at UCL. Their students would only begin to supervise their few doctorates as they began in the mid-1970s, Owen Houghton and Gwyn Lewis and such. Directing a generation of French theses and filling out jobs was thus under only 4 leaders at any one given time. But we must understand that they had students that weren't just coming from England or even Britain. What is striking, including on that list, is how many came from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, America, South Africa. They all flocked to do a thesis under Cobham or Cobb. And it was, after all, as I've learned, because they were such strategic figures in representing either political or a new type of social history. And England was the perfect base to prepare research for France. After all, I mean, just right across the channel to get to the archives. At the time, Commonwealth and other fellowships allowed BAs from the former empire to live quite comfortably in Britain or France for study. In this manner, if you look at any one given period you want to examine, only a clutch of 2 or 3 English professors literally seeded the growing Canadian and Australian and New Zealand university systems, as well as some key American posts with their students. These doctorates then went on to shape French history in their own respective countries as inheritors from University College London and Oxford. So the former empire acted as an echo amplifier for English influence far beyond what another country might expect, at least for the Anglophone world. Cobb, Roberts, Douglas Johnson, and Cobham all believed that objective expert empiricism was vital to inculcate professional knowledge in a tradition that prized informal individuality. Cobb firmly believed that Britain's proximity to France enabled its dedicated students to acquire a truer second identity with that country. British-French connections, in his view, would be a hybrid school, particularly to understand French society in its provincial roots, which he felt American students from a much greater distance could not achieve. Most differently from America, however, was that doctoral training in England was done completely under the sole thesis director. This was a great revelation, and I must thank all the professors who explained how one did graduate work in England. Everyone, there was no coursework. There was no requirement to attend seminars, and even an English seminar was not what we in America might think it might be. There were no preliminary exams. There was no preparation for teaching. One read secondary literature at the key library in England for about a year. You then went on to research in France for about a year, maybe as much as a year and a half. Then you wrote your thesis, 3 years, sometimes more, but they like to get it done in only 3 or 4 years. And remember, your undergraduate was only 3 years too, so you were younger than your American counterpart. Your defense, or your viva voce, was before 2 or at most 3 selected faculty. You did not learn under a department as in America. There were no interdisciplinary opportunities or incentives unless one ventured on one's own to meet people outside the normal history faculty in one's own informal way. Everybody, the entire system was designed to filter and refine specialized elites, even down to the secondary school level. There was particularly no influence, even from French academics, either in regular teaching or in the aid of examining theses. I think I found one case where this was done. The result of this environment, while not determinative, I believe, had a profound impact for all the overall writing of general interpretation regarding the Ancien regime and Napoleonic era. First, the students of England after 1960 published both extensive monographs from their theses and more general overall narratives. Unlike their American counterparts, the English faculty continued to produce synthetic works at a steady, ever-growing rate. There was no standard Western civ, and the intended English-speaking markets seemed to demand new specialized texts. Thus, after 1970, the historians produced from the English tradition simply dominated the production of narratives on the era of the 1970s, or on the era of the mid-18th century to the Restoration. It was not that monographs or articles had no voice, but they were aimed at their own peers. Honestly, they did not intend to be synthetic works of meaning or comprehensive narratives of the Revolution addressing it in all of its facets. The English also faced no hesitation about ending the useful Lefebvrean consensus, nor was there pressure to meet wide expectations about civic meaning other than one's own personal conclusions. This steered the flow of overall English language interpretation as a steady stream of synthetic works on the overall era as it flowed out of England, Britain, and the Commonwealth-based students thereof. Further, at most British universities, there was little interest between the 1960s and 1980s in interdisciplinary ideas. Even from the pro-socialist left, monographs were empirical and generally descriptive. Reviews and review essays, however, could be more biting and even personal at times. I have found no institutional or really intellectual support to rally English historians around social theory or the social sciences from the 1960s to maybe the early 1980s in this thesis work. Thesis supervisors for French history were at best cool to American openness to blend history on France into lines of social theory. They repeatedly spoke out against the contamination of empirical, unbiased Verstehen, if we use German word for understanding of sources, by imported evils, easily labeled as presentism or anachronism. Of course, after 1970, historians were liberals, conservatives, and some radicals, and some did support the Sibylian left. But the thesis directors who shaped French history, they were all anti-Marxist before the 1970s even, and most associated with conservatism one way or another at or by 1980. In England, one doctoral student, really only one truly identified with socialism. I found female professors trained by these leaders to be politically neutral in their writings, in my own readings, while often critical of the French revolutionary heritage in one way or another. Thus, under Cobbin or Johnson, there was a clear site to critique Marxist history from the angle of political theory and thought. Cobb's form of social history attracted the left, but even perhaps more conservative liberals like Roberts and Cambridge students who became more moderate, kind of pro-Thatcherite conservatives. If we dig closely into the entirety of writings, quotes or words related to the French Revolution began to bear out at least threads of a pattern for many. This set the tenor, though not a whole block. No blanket of national ideological paradigm existed. But whereas the American field of French history moved to the left of its preceding generation after 1960, in the English case, much of the entire Commonwealth training in French history, particularly on the Revolution, was concentrated under less than a handful of historians who shared a conservative, if not an anti-Marxist temperament in the context of wider academia. Americans, on the other hand, had to be engaged in civic pedagogy. The Revolution was within a Western civ that validated progress towards Republican democracy, so shared by our identity, and the English simply did not. The mean, if you take the average of its faculty, were therefore to the relative right of American counterparts on France when it concerned nationalism, the legitimacy of revolution, morality of popular sovereignty, social material equality, and how raw democracy could operate if free from elite leadership. If Americans celebrated 1789 and the idea of sister republics, from the cliffs of Dover, one had greater sensitivity to another powerful centralizing state with universalist intentions of political authority. Trained in neutral empiricism, in general, England recruited students who did not consider their rationale for becoming French historians to validate contemporary civics, nor did they desire to alter the arc of domestic politics by their pedagogy. It is not simply that English-trained historians basically overtook the entire language of the general narratives of the revolutionary decade from 1970 to 1995. Most were openly opposed in one way or another to Marxist historiography, and they were quite skeptical of the legacy of the revolution and wider Europe. Now again, we're not going to talk, we don't have time, and there's so much more to it, to part two, so I'm just going to summarize right now the final paragraph. This project's goal, was to offer a coherent theory that suggests more accurately how Anglophone historians debated the French Revolution in the past century. It is hardly perfect, and I invite colleagues from wherever to test it for validation or modification with your own lived experience. But I believe it is time to pause, to reanalyze and to reconsider some accepted truths of our core historiography, perhaps without claiming a final definitive answer. Putting critique to one's own thesis, I can consider several areas that remain unresolved. In the process, I hope we can more generally appreciate the core tie between new research and the final importance of wider synthetic works for the teaching that supports our very existence. Given the current crisis in French, European, or even the decline of history in general, this may be a rewarding constructive exercise. Second, we need simply to end the myth of Anglo-Saxon historiography. While never really dogmatic, it has hidden the existence of subtle national voices and how indeed they shape the terms of historiographical interpretation over time. We need to recognize its contours as we further chart the course of French history through the increasingly challenging waters that we face collectively here in the 21st century. Thank you.